All right. Welcome in, everyone. I can't see who all's joined yet, but welcome in. I know we have a lot of you waiting right off the top. Um, Welcome to Project Coyote's webinar on how rodenticides threaten bobcats, coyotes, and urban wildlife. So thank you all for being here. Nanette started us in the chat by saying hi and where you're from. I'd love to see more people throwing your location in the chat just so we can see where everyone's joining from. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Sylvia, for sharing. I'm joining myself from San Diego, California today. We're so excited to have people from all over the country. We can talk about all of the work that's being done on rodenticide reform right now to protect wildlife all over the US. We're even doing some work in Canada, seeing movement. So we're so excited to get this conversation started. I'm going to jump right in for time. So, Project Coyote advocates for rodenticide reform because these poisons do not stay contained. They cause widespread secondary poisoning that harms wild carnivores and other wildlife, disrupts ecosystems, and undermines humane, effective coexistence. In 2026, Project Coyote led on advancing rodenticide reform bills in 2 states, and there are active efforts from other groups in at least 10 other states that we're working to support. So, before we jump into the details, I wanted to just shout out that Project Coyote has released a few downloadable resources. We create these accessible, shareable materials that equip communities with really clear science-based information and practical tools that we can use to protect and coexist with wildlife. So I just wanted to shout out for rodenticides. We, on our website, we host an in-depth 3-page fact sheet on the impacts of rodenticides and some of those practical tools we can use to reduce poison use. And we recently released 2 new 1-page flyer fact sheets, one focused on wildlife impacts of rodenticides and the impacts of rodenticides on children and pets or companion animals too. So you can find both of these on our website's downloadable resource page, which Amelia is going to drop a link to in the chat, so you can all check that out later. And then I also wanted to shout out, if you're not already part of it, you can join Project Coyote's e-team to follow our work, and you'll receive calls to action in your state or in your region via email if you join our e-team. So Amelia, I think, is going to drop a link to joining our e-team in the chat as well. And of course, if you want to make a donation to Project Coyote, we'll drop a link in the chat to do so as well. So let's jump right in with our 2 speakers for this talk. I wanted to introduce first Dr. Laurel Serieys, who's a conservation biologist. She's a postdoctoral researcher with The Ohio State University and with Urban Coyote Research Project. Dr. Serieys has studied how urban environments affect wild carnivores like coyotes and bobcats. In particular, bobcats is the focus of her research, and she's going to talk with us about today. This groundbreaking research has revealed how rodenticide exposure has compromises immune systems in wild animals and disease resistance. And really, her research has helped build this scientific foundation for California's restrictions on anticoagulant rodenticides and beyond. And then right after Laurel, we will hear from Lisa Owens Viani, who's the executive director of Raptors Are The Solution, also known as RATS. And Lisa is a freelance writer, an editor, and really just a leading wildlife advocate, as well as founding Raptors Are The Solution. She's played a key role in advancing California's landmark rodenticide restrictions and eventual ban on anticoagulant rodenticides, and more through years of advocacy and coalition building. So Lisa's going to talk with us a little bit today about how rodenticide policies are developed and implemented and how we can, as in our communities, help advance stronger protections for wildlife. So, audience, I wanted to throw to you. We do have a Q&A box in Zoom, so please enter your questions for Laurel and Lisa as they're talking, and we will have time for some questions at the end. So throw your questions in the chat. We'll try to answer some via text. And just as and then of course we'll talk with Lisa and Laurel at the end here. And then just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. So you can go back and we'll send out the recording after the webinar and you can go back and watch it later or share it with friends. So with that, I think we want to send it back over to Dr. Serieys here to share your screen and talk with us a little bit about your work.
Okay.
Thank you, Laurel.
Okay, you can see it?
Looks great.
Okay. All right, so thank you for the introduction. My name is Dr. Laurel Serieys, and as Kiely mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Ohio State University. But I got my start studying anticoagulant rodenticides as a PhD student at the University of California in Los Angeles. And it was the topic of my PhD dissertation research in examining how anticoagulant rodenticides affect health and disease susceptibility in bobcats. So I'll talk generally about anticoagulants and then focus a little bit on the research that I did for my PhD. Sorry, I'm having trouble figuring out how to advance slides. Okay, so first of all, how anticoagulant rodenticides work. So they interrupt the vitamin K cycle, which occurs in the liver and is essential for the production of various clotting factors. And so the result is that once anticoagulant rodenticides interfere with the vitamin K cycle, it can cause fatal, uncontrolled internal bleeding once a lethal dose is ingested. So you may have heard about first and second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So I just wanted to go over that briefly. So examples of first generation anticoagulants are warfarin and chlorphacinone, and second generation most commonly are brodifacoum and bromadiolone. They work using the same mechanism of interrupting the vitamin K cycle, but they have differences in potency. So first generation are lower potency and require multiple feedings to achieve a lethal dose, whereas the second generation has much higher potency and a lethal dose can be achieved with a single feeding. The half-life also differs considerably. So for first generation, the half-life is on the order of days to weeks, whereas in second generation, the half-life is on the order of weeks to months. They also have different persistence in the environment, with first generation having lower environmental persistence and second generation having higher environmental persistence and remaining active in soil and water for long periods of time. In terms of risk to non-target wildlife, the first generation, because of their lower potency and because of their shortened persistence, they have a lower risk of secondary poisoning, whereas because of the higher potency and the longer persistence, the second generations have a higher risk of secondary poisoning and a risk of bioaccumulating in food webs. And then in terms of uses, they're often used around human structures and pretty much anywhere humans live. First generations are also commonly used in agricultural areas. So we talk a lot about anticoagulant exposure, and I think we often think of what's happening in the United States, but I just wanted to show that the issue of exposure to anticoagulant rodenticides is global. I've pulled these figures of exposure rates from different peer-reviewed studies, and so you can see for predatory birds, There's exposure happening in owls in Canada and Portugal, buzzards in Denmark, and then eagles, vultures, owls, and red-tailed hawks in the United States. And then for mammals, interestingly, lesser short-tailed bats were 83% were detected exposed, which it is interesting because they're insectivores, and so the mode of exposure is unknown. Predatory marsupials in Australia, red foxes in Spain, and then other predatory species in California and caracals in South Africa are also exposed. Another thing to note is that when we look at exposure rates, we can see very high exposure rates in a lot of study areas. And so it is a big problem for wildlife. In terms of how predatory species are being exposed, the poisons are being used to target small mammals. And because there is a delayed effect where it can take 10 days to kill an animal after a lethal dose is ingested, those small mammals that have been exposed can be running around near natural areas or even in urban settings where there's predatory birds. And as they become sickened over time by the poisons, they become easy prey for predatory species. And so the poisons end up bioaccumulating in the food web. So one issue that we're aware of for wildlife is that there are repeated exposure events. And there was an experiment done that showed how problematic repeated exposure events can be. So this is just a graphical abstract of that experiment that I just wanted to show. So what they did first was they exposed kestrels to a second generation anticoagulant. They gave them time to recover from exposure to the anticoagulant by monitoring their clotting time and liver residues. And then they exposed them again, this time to a first generation anticoagulant, and found that the effects on clotting time were even worse than when they were exposed to brodifacoum alone. And so it's possible that repeated exposure events have outsized effects. And it's also possible that there's interactive effects between first and second generation anticoagulants, or even different compounds within the same generation. So just to briefly touch on the research I did for my PhD, I investigated the reach and effects of these poisons in bobcats, and I studied them near Los Angeles and in Orange County. I collected 172 liver samples. So when we talk about exposure in wildlife, what we're doing is we're collecting liver post-mortem and testing that for exposure. So that means that for all these studies that we read about, the animals that are exposed are generally, the results are coming after they've died from various causes. So for the bobcats, I collected 172 liver samples, and from animals that had died primarily of mange and vehicle collision. I tested them for anticoagulant exposure, and the outcome was to determine whether or not animals were exposed, the total residue concentration for the different compounds, and then the total number of compounds animals were exposed to. Sorry. Okay, so what I detected was 92% of bobcats were exposed in my study area. But one of the interesting things that we found was that the rodenticide levels track reported use over time. So looking at the red bars, those are the liver residue concentrations that we detected in the bobcats, whereas the black bars are what was reportedly applied in terms of the rodenticides applied in the study area. And you can see a correlation between the two. And so I think what's important to take away from this graph is that what we're putting into the system, we can directly see in the wildlife that are being exposed. but also that any effort to reduce the amount of rodenticides on the landscape can have a positive effect. So for the bobcats, they are extremely tolerant to the anti-clotting effects of anticoagulants. And this is just a generalization for felids. So what we found with our bobcats is that exposure is chronic but rarely lethal. And that is because of the tolerance to the anti-clotting effects. Other interesting things that we detected is fetal exposures, where anticoagulants can cross the placenta and expose developing kittens. We detected multiple compounds, which indicates multiple exposure events because the baits are developed with a single compound. We detected a wide range of concentrations with some animals exposed to really high levels. And so that indicates an accumulation of rodenticide exposure over time. And yet during that a 20-year period of studying these bobcats, only 2 bobcat deaths were linked to anticoagulants. However, what we have seen in our study area was a precipitous population decline due to notoedric mange. And population declines associated with mange in felids is really unusual and was never documented in the literature before we discovered this in our bobcat population in Los Angeles. And so because of the unusual nature, we did a little bit more investigating and sent bobcats that died of mange to veterinary pathologists. And what we found was that bobcats that died of mange had higher liver residues compared with bobcats that died of other sources of mortality. And specifically, we found that bobcats that were exposed to 2 or more compounds were 7.3 times more likely to die of notoedric mange. So this raised the question about whether or not there are sublethal consequences of exposure for bobcats that increases their susceptibility to fatal mange. So what I did to address this question was investigate their immune and organ system function in bobcats that were exposed to rodenticides and bobcats that were not exposed. And what I found was evidence of both immune suppression and immune activation in these bobcats using multiple immune markers. And so the result is an immune dysfunction where simultaneous inflammation and suppression can reduce the ability to fight infections and maintain health. So we believe this immune dysregulation that we discovered explains the susceptibility to mange. We can't say for sure that this is what is going on because we can't perform laboratory experiments that establish a causal mechanism. But the type of immune dysfunction we detected can explain the susceptibility to mange, where when an animal is exposed to the mange mite, the demand on the immune system increases. Meanwhile, anticoagulant exposure is decreasing the function, and that possibly leads to increased susceptibility to notoedric mange. So some key takeaways from my talk are that our anticoagulant rodenticides are widely used globally. Pretty much anywhere that we test for anticoagulant exposure, we find it. Most studies have been conducted in North America and Europe, so there's a lot to be accomplished in terms of looking at exposure in areas like in Asia and other parts of the world in the global South, South America. So wildlife is at risk and impacts are often undercounted. So they cause illness and death in non-target wildlife, but it's hard to know how many animals actually die of exposure to anticoagulants. So that is a big unknown. Second generation rodenticides pose a greater threat and are more likely to bioaccumulate in food webs. Chronic exposure matters and repeated exposure events matter. So even low levels of exposure over time can lead to deadly effects in wildlife, and there are cumulative and potentially interactive effects of being chronically exposed to multiple compounds. And then potential sublethal effects are a problem, but widely unknown. So our study on bobcats was the first to try to pin down a sublethal consequence of exposure in a wild species. But doing those experiments is extremely difficult. And so essentially, very little is known about other potential sublethal consequences. So with that, I am ending my talk and we'll be happy to take questions at the end of the session. But if you have any questions about this or my work in general, please feel free to email me at lekserious@gmail.com. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Laurel, for giving us that introduction. We're getting some questions in about your science and just some more connections that we'll circle back to. But first, let's hear from Lisa about policy pathways and solutions.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Great.
Thank you so much to Project Coyote for organizing this webinar and for asking me to speak today. I'm going to talk a little bit about strategies for reducing rodenticides, including policy strategies. And I'm going to be talking about what we did in California and how we got the legislation passed that we did get passed over the past 5 years, and what that means and where we're going moving forward. Our website is raptorsarethesolution.org, and you can reach us at raptorsarethesolution@gmail.com. We were formed about 13 years ago in Berkeley. We're a project of Earth Island Institute, a nonprofit project of Earth Island Institute. I co-founded Raptors Are The Solution with a raptor biologist, Alan Fish. Our vision is for a healthy, functioning food web in which every organism remains poison-free. Rat poisons undermine a critical piece of this system, the predator-prey relationship. In an ideal world, we'd have no rodenticides and no powerful big agriculture or pest control lobbies, but that is not the world we live in right now. So sometimes we need to employ creative strategies. So what we've done is employ a multi-pronged strategy to tackle this issue. First of all, public education and building a lot of partnerships. We've done a lot of that. Getting legislation passed and actually initiating and conducting litigation. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to show you a few images from a new graphic novel that we have published that basically tells our story. But this is just, it's a personal story for me as well. I was watching a nest of Cooper's hawks in Berkeley for the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory. You can see the hawk with a squirrel on the left-hand side. And what happened is, and here's the parent feeding its babies. This was the fledgling stage. And what happened is my neighbor found 2 of the fledglings in his little kid's swimming pool. And he came running over to my house with their bodies in a black plastic garbage bag. And he knew that I knew raptors and was watching the nest, etc. And he was very distraught. And so I took their bodies to Wild Care, which is a wildlife rehab center in San Rafael, California, who sent them to UC Davis for testing, and they were confirmed to have multiple anticoagulants in their bodies. I believe it was both second and first generation. And this is just a scene from our graphic novel where the animals are basically watching these pest control companies put out these horrible bait boxes and asking, what are they doing? Don't they know we control the rodents without using poison? So we started off going door to door. We tried to figure out who was using the poison, which was kind of impossible. We just talked to people in our neighborhood, went around and around, put up flyers, leaflets, did everything we could kind of on a grassroots level to try to figure out what we could do. We even talked to pest control operators who basically said, oh, we love owls. We aren't trying to hurt owls. But of course, you know, they were. These bait boxes that contain the poisons are really an attractive nuisance. This was a red-tailed hawk in San Francisco that learned to wait for poisoned rodents to come out of a bait box outside a Safeway store. The hawk was so smart, he realized they would come out and be easy to catch because they were sick and poisoned. And so, because they'd probably been going back to the bait box numerous times. So we were able to get that store to stop using this poison. This was kind of early on in our efforts. I'm going back a while in time. But we realized like these poisons were kind of in a way a little bit like DDT in the sense that they had infiltrated the entire ecosystem. Everything from insects were getting into the poison bait boxes and spreading it to earthworms and songbirds, terrestrial animals, even aquatic animals. We've had river otters exposed to anticoagulants in California. So we tried to strategize, we kept meeting and thinking, well, we know this is more than a local problem, so what can we do? So we started building a coalition in California. We're a huge state, so basically all throughout the state from north to south, we kind of partnered with other nonprofits, and those included watershed groups, environmental groups of all kinds. Just a shout out to some of those groups. Poison Free Malibu was really involved, really took a lot of local action in their community. Center for Biological Diversity, Animal Legal Defense Fund, Citizens for Los Angeles Wildlife, and of course Project Coyote, which was an integral partner from the very beginning. So we did education, we put up billboards, we put up bus ads, we put up subway signs, we did a lot of tabling, just thinking the more we can get the word out, the better. And little kids always understand the issue right away. They're very clear on what happens, interestingly enough. This was a bus tale that we did in San Francisco. These are some billboards we did on the North Coast. That's Maura Gabriel on the bottom right. He's a scientist who studies the impacts of anticoagulants in the Pacific fisher, which is a very rare carnivore. Its numbers are seriously declining. And his science has been integral, as has Laurel's, to the work that we've done. This is a bus ad. We started doing bus ads in Sacramento surrounding the state capitol in the hope that maybe legislators would catch their eyes and they would grab their attention. And this is at the same time we were kind of going forward and trying to introduce legislation. This was a billboard we did in Seattle where they were having an eruption of snowy owls that were visiting for the winter. And so there was a lot of concern that snowy owls were being exposed to anticoagulants because they were eating a lot of rats in Seattle. And so we put up a billboard at that time. And then we've tried to target agricultural areas a lot because in our legislation, which I'll talk about more, we were unfortunately forced to exempt agriculture, which is a huge problem. So we're still focused on those ag areas as much as we can. That's supposed to be Jonathan Evans at the top there. We decided to hold a rally in Sacramento at the same time the pest control companies were having their annual conference. This was back in 2016. That was our rally. We took the skin from one of those huge billboards and unfurled it on the lawn of the state capitol. And then we marched around blocks and blocks shouting anti-rat poison slogans. We've tried to keep the issue in the public eye in newspapers, online. Every chance we get, we'll try to do an op-ed or something else just to keep this issue alive. We've had our materials and posters translated into, I think, 12 different languages throughout the world. These are all, this one just went crazy on social media, but these are all available on our website at raptorsarethesolution.org. But then we realized taking local action was not really getting us anywhere, getting us far enough, fast enough. So we met with an environmental attorney. His name is Mike Graff. I had worked with him before on another environmental issue. And basically, I was just in despair. And I went to him and said, like, what else can we do? We've got to do something about this. All of these animals are dying and being poisoned. And so he suggested we file a challenge under the California Environmental Quality Act, known as CEQA. And what that legal challenge did was say, hey, state of California, you're not studying all of the impacts on non-target animals. And under CEQA, they are supposed to very carefully study all of the environmental impacts of a project. And so we argued that basically every year when they renew these poisons in our state, that constitutes a project and they weren't studying the impacts adequately. Our lawsuit was based on a lot on the work of Laurel Serieys, the work that she just described, and I won't go into that because she did that so well, but just groundbreaking science. So we filed that lawsuit in 2018, and at first our state Department of Pesticide Regulation said, no, we're not going to reevaluate. We're not going to reevaluate these poisons. We don't think there's a problem. But interestingly enough, just a few months after we filed the lawsuit, they decided they were going to reevaluate second generation anticoagulants. So it was interesting timing. And Assembly member Richard Bloom from Southern California decided that he would agree to introduce AB 1788, which happened in 2019. So we had this reevaluation underway, and then Richard Bloom introduced this bill, this first bill. In the meantime, we went and met with legislators. We took stacks and stacks of studies from around the world, scientific studies. We went and we met with very skeptical legislators. We just relentlessly did outreach to our decision makers. We presented them with infographics, studies, but most importantly, we had decades worth of data from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They had been studying these impacts for decades. So we went to our legislators and our governor and said, hey, your own state has been studying and we've known about these issues for years. So how did we go from grassroots and public education to passing 3 bills? We took this multi-pronged strategy. We spent years trying to get legislation passed. Our first bills were not successful because what we did is we tried to get all poisons banned, everything. We didn't even get out of our first committee. So I don't recommend that strategy. I recommend going for what we call the worst of the worst, the second generation anticoagulants, and taking kind of a targeted, focused, iterative approach, which can be very frustrating, but it is the only way we were able to do what we did. So in the meantime, our lawsuit was going along as the state was reevaluating second gens. We persisted in asking for the state to reevaluate the first gens as well, because we knew that especially when not only do they have their own impacts, but when they're added to the second generations, you can have a cumulative impact. We lost at the trial court level, but we appealed and the appellate court ruled in our favor. That California must reevaluate difecinone, which is a first generation anticoagulant, due to its impacts on wildlife. And we had a lot of data on that. And so with that legal decision, we then went back and got another bill passed, AB 1322, which put a moratorium on difecinone. And then 2 years later, we got AB 2552 passed as well, which adds the remaining 2 first generation to the moratorium. So I just want to emphasize that it's a moratorium. It's not actually a ban. It's not permanent. It's in place while the state restudies these poisons. Of course, we're hoping that it will become a ban, but there's a little bit of an issue that I'll talk about in a minute. So this is just a depiction of Governor Newsom signing one of the bills. And we had, you can see on the left, just all the groups that we had in our coalition. And I think that was a huge part of our success. Again, just these groups from the north to the south of our state, all different types of groups. And that really affected our legislators. So again, just to summarize, AB 1788 put a moratorium on second gens, 1322, a moratorium on difecinone, and 2552, adding the last 2 first gens into the moratorium. So the lessons I would say that we've learned so far are A, if you can, have the data, the scientific data to back up your efforts. Again, I can't emphasize enough how having that California Fish and Wildlife data was just critical to our efforts. If your state does not monitor wildlife for rodenticides, I would say try to find a legislator who can try to help find funding for your state to start collecting data if they don't have it yet. Another idea is to go to wildlife rehab groups, which often do collect data, and try to compile it that way. Build a coalition. You need a sympathetic legislator who's in it for the long haul and can withstand pressure from the industry. I will say that Richard Bloom and Laura Friedman both were just impervious to the constant pressure they were under from these pesticide companies and manufacturers. It was constant, and they are a really aggressive lobby. So you need someone who can just really stand up to that. And I guess my key suggestion, and this is something I really want to emphasize, is consider litigation. Consider partnering with universities who have wildlife and environmental health clinics. We partnered with Stanford Environmental Law Clinic on our appellate court work. And Massachusetts is actually doing something similar to what we did, where they partnered with Harvard Law to basically challenge their state's registration of these poisons. So the idea, again, is to kind of challenge the registration. Like, hey, state, you don't need to be registering these products with all these impacts they're having. It's possible to find a good either pro bono or environmental attorney who's willing to take the case on a contingency basis. That's actually what we did. It's a little scary because you have to, worry that you might lose and have to pay the attorney. Actually very scary. I lost a lot of sleep over that. But anyway, I would say that's really my big suggestion. And I think that, again, these university wildlife and environmental health clinics are really a good way to go. They can often help you pro bono. I know that in New York, there are some activist groups partnering with universities on this very issue. And the reason is just that I think litigation and legislation can pack a 1-2 punch where you kind of get them boxed into a corner. If you're not ready for that, working with local municipalities to build up support is a good idea. We did work with local municipalities before we got our first bill passed. And what we did is this was actually before second-gen ARs were taken off consumer shelves. We got cities to send letters to hardware stores asking them to voluntarily remove the products from their store shelves, and many of them did. And then we got cities to pass resolutions saying that they would not use these products on their own properties. In California, cities can't ban what the state doesn't ban, so they basically couldn't tell private people you can't use those, but they could make a difference on their own properties and their parks and things like that. And again, consider starting with the worst of the worst, the second gen. As frustrating as it is, taking a step-by-step approach can pay off. You can try doing a lesser bill to begin with. Our first bill was basically removing anticoagulants from state-owned parks. And then just in terms of are these policies making a difference in California? We are right now analyzing all of the California Fish and Wildlife data for the past 15 years. And I can say that we are starting to see what looks to be an improvement for raptors. For mammals, it doesn't look as good. And my personal feeling is that's probably a lot due to this agriculture exemption. But we'll come out with a report later in the year, hopefully late summer. And we're doing this because our State Department of Pesticide regulation is already trying to weaken the regulations that we've put into place. And we're very concerned about that. So we want to have our own analysis ready to go to be prepared to fight back with what they're going to come out with. So that's kind of my spiel. And just I always like to end with this quote from Rachel Carson, that the public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road. And it can only do so when in full possession of the facts. We have the facts, we have the science, we have the data. So it's time for action on this. And I hope, people here can be a bit inspired to take some action as well. And then I just wanted to thank all of the photographers who've given us their wonderful photos for this presentation and others over the years. So be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that introduction to policy and taking us on that journey. We have so many questions coming in, so I want to try to get have some time to answer most of them. Maybe we could start with Lisa. We got a few people asking about getting access to the graphic novel that you shared. Some folks are asking if they can find it on the website. Mary says she's a school teacher and some of her students are watching and we'd love to get the graphic novel. And I know there was other interest too.
We will ship the graphic novels to schools in the US and to environmental museums and other groups free of charge. We have a grant to ship them out. So just contact me at raptorsarethe solution@gmail.com and we can send you the books And yeah, they're great for kids and actually people of all ages. So I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you, Lisa. That's awesome. Um, so I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the science and the data. Lisa, you shouted out just how important um, Laurel's data and just in general gathering this data from the states, et cetera, is in doing the policy work that we're trying to accomplish. Joe Thompson's asking, how can a state collect data? How do we get data? Do either of you have any thoughts on the sort of the high level, policy level data and how it's collected?
Well, I will say that I don't think there are that many state wildlife agencies that are collecting this data. And again, in California, we were just lucky that our state agencies had been collecting it for years. So if your state Fish and Wildlife or Fish and Game or whatever they're called is not collecting data, I would try to find a legislator and get them to introduce a bill that will fund that effort. And so, you would need to go to the legislature and explain what a comprehensive problem this is and maybe take some scientific studies from elsewhere and then just try to get funding and or go to wildlife rehab centers and see if they're collecting data as a starting point. Sometimes universities, I know in Massachusetts, Tufts University was doing some really critical studies and they had some data, but I know that they've also had to go to wildlife rehabbers and try to get more of that. So it can be, a bit frustrating.
Yeah, and on that note, we had some questions, Laurel, about kind of how data is collected. Nicole was asking, where do you find bobcats who have died and kind of like how that process works? And then, yeah, maybe we could start with that. And then there's some more questions on kind of the methods.
Okay, so I was fortunate enough to be collaborating with the National Park Service and with USGS, and they had projects GPS collaring bobcats. And so, as far as the mangy bobcats go, well, and the ones that died of vehicle collision, the collars are great because if the animal dies, it sends you a notification and you can go recover the animal's body and determine the cause of mortality pretty quickly. We also opportunistically just collected bobcats that we found that died, on a road. It's easy to see animals that have been hit by cars. So just opportunistically collecting those animals. And then for mangy bobcats, they seem to be attracted to urban areas as they get closer to death. And so some would just die in people's yards and report it to us. So there was a network of people reporting deaths to me as far as mangy bobcats go. And then being fortunate enough to collaborate with a group that was actually collaring animals so we could monitor their movements as well as if they died.
Okay, that's great. And we got a question from KV asking about, I think, relatedly, are you in touch, Laurel, during any of your method and your practice on the science side with um, fish and wildlife departments or working with the state at all, or rehab, wildlife rescuers or rehabbers during your work?
Yes, so I actually captured a few mangy bob. So to do my work, I did capture bobcats. I captured 60 bobcats, and in collaboration with the National Park Service, they were also capturing bobcats to collar them. I was just capturing them to collect blood samples so I could do my immune analyses. And so I captured mangy bobcats and I took them to a rehab facility and then was able to release them once they had recovered back into their natural areas. So there are a couple rehabbers in LA that I would interact with. And then, for any type of research that you do that involves capturing animals and collecting samples, you have to work with the state, just to get a permit. So on that level, I was working with the state and they were aware of the research that I was doing. But generally, I was collaborating with the National Park Service, USGS, and then Colorado State University as well So it was a collaborative effort with multiple stakeholders.
Okay, that's great. And we got a number of questions then trying to kind of extrapolate maybe to other species. Some questions for you, Laurel. Are you doing similar research involving any other species? And also, we got people shouting out bats, coyotes, even potentially insects or who are eating carrion from these, rodent bodies. Any thoughts on other species that could be impacted? And do we, have any data on that? Do we need more information, more data?
Well, I think we need more information. There's so many unknowns, and especially as I mentioned, the sublethal consequences are so difficult to determine. And so, yes, trying to understand just the vector of exposure for animals like an insectivore, how are they being exposed? 83% of black bears in California were exposed. Like, how are they being exposed? They are omnivores that don't necessarily eat a huge number of rodents. And the same for mountain lions, they're not huge rodent eaters, but they're probably being exposed through coyotes and bobcats that they consume, but we're not sure. So trying to understand how the poisons are moving through the food web is one place that requires more research. And then trying to evaluate sublethal consequences, even looking at other species and their immune response to exposure to anticoagulants would be a great place to start. There have been laboratory studies looking at the immune response of rodents to warfarin exposure, and they found similar things as we found in our bobcats. And then humans that take warfarin for medical conditions also have immune activation. So this isn't something that we're, like pulling out of nowhere. There's evidence that for other species as well, the anticoagulants can cause some immune effects. And so trying to evaluate that for other species would be really useful. But we can't say without doing that, as scientists, we have to be clear and cut and dry and say we just don't know for these other species whether the same phenomena are happening. I am not currently involved in rodenticide research, except I am collaborating on a project of caracals in South Africa at the moment. But otherwise, my research focuses on the ecology of coyotes. So I've sort of moved away from this topic, but it is something I'm very interested in and sort of keeping up with as time goes on.
That's great. Thank you, Laurel. Moving to policy pathways a little bit, Lisa, we got a lot of questions about sort of the strategy, how we can approach making, obtaining rodenticide reform and sort of the strategies that we can use to do that. One thing you talked about is starting with SCARs, those second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, which we know are some of the most deadly and toxic, and we have some of the most data on. Um, do you think that, I guess maybe you could speak to basically how that strategy came about, starting with those second generation anticoagulants and then moving to, let's say, the lower risk, as Nicole asked about the lower risk, like the first generation anticoagulants or other forms of rodenticides that may be at least perceived as lower risk right now. Could you speak to maybe why that has been the political strategy so far, at least in California, where you have experience?
Um, Again, like as I mentioned in my talk, we started off trying to get everything banned, every type of rat poison, and we didn't make it out of one committee. The next year we went back and we went for all the anticoagulants. We didn't make it, I think we made it out of two committees. So we realized like this isn't going to work. We have to basically say, look, let's get rid of these very, very toxic ones first. And then we knew after that, maybe we could then go back and go for the other ones. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. So I guess, like what I want to be my takeaway is look for a way to challenge your state's registration of these products. Find a pro bono attorney, a good environmental attorney, or partner with a university law clinic and try to find a way to challenge these products being registered in your state every year. They should all be illegal. We should have a national ban, but we don't. So, it's really taking an iterative approach, going state by state, going for the worst of the worst, and then going back and trying to go as much as you can after the rest. Because we do know they have cumulative impacts when they're added one on top of the other. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Laurel mentioned Ratner's research, and he has shown that. So that's my best advice. Like try, I think that kind of, like I said, like 1-2 punch of legislation and litigation and kind of box your state into a corner is really, that's what I recommend. In addition to doing all the public education while you're at that too, just to keep everything in the public eye is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And we got some questions actually about from where is the question? About one was about basically I hear from Richard about trying to approach at the federal level, potentially, adding some amendments to the Federal Rodenticide and Pesticide Act that regulates at the federal level. Um, and then we also got some questions about are there pathways in other states besides California? Um, do you want to shout out some of those pathways or maybe speak to the federal approach that you're involved with at all, Lisa?
I don't think a federal approach is going anywhere right now. I don't see this EPA doing anything on this. I know that they actually did come out with some new recommendations that had to do with still allowing the poisons, but requiring the pest control operators to go out and collect the dead bodies, which seems really infeasible to me and unlikely because by the time a pest control operator gets out to collect a body, a predator's most likely to have already gotten it. So that kind of seemed ridiculous. And I know that California is even thinking of something like that. So um, I don't think right now the federal government is going to, I mean, maybe I'm being too negative, but I don't see that changing at the moment.
Do
So.
you think that if we had some changes at the federal level, we'd be able to see progress there, or are we still hoping to build more at the state level to get us there?
I mean,
Or
I would love to see a federal top-down approach, just these can't be used anymore, period. We know they're killing our eagles and our owls and our bobcats and we know what they do. So it's just, yeah, that would be ideal.
Yeah. And Peggy Clark was asking about if state level legislation is feasible in other states outside of California. I'll just shout out Peggy. We worked at Project Coyote worked this year in Colorado and Vermont to introduce bills, and we've been supporting bills in a bunch of other states. I saw Laura Kiesel's here, shout out in the chat. She's doing amazing work in Massachusetts, and they've made amazing progress building a grassroots coalition of all kinds of supporters, and they've had amazing progress at multiple levels, not just with bills, but other approaches as well in that state. And we're seeing more work in New Hampshire, in Maine, Washington State, a few other states that I can't think of off the top of my head. I don't know if you want to shout any more out, Lisa, on progress at the state level.
Yeah, I mean, Colorado, you had that bill this year. Rhode Island, New York has a bill
New
right
York.
now. I think the most promising bill is Massachusetts, and I'm really hoping that one goes through. If it does, it will be stronger than California's, and I would just love for that to set the standard.
Yeah, that would be awesome. So we also got a number of different questions asking about alternatives to rodenticides and things that we can point people to, how we can educate our neighbors and our communities about safer alternatives that we can suggest. Do either of you want to shout out some kind of strategies that you nor typically point people to?
We have a whole series of posters and educational information on our website at raptorsarethesolution.org that contain non-toxic solution suggestions. A whole series of them, ranging from what you can do if rodents are in your car to your crawl space, your house, your farm. And so they're geared, and we even worked with a pest control company to do one about restaurants. So those are all downloadable, and we can also mail those to people at no charge if you like, to be able to spread the word that way. One of the things that, really the bottom line best solution is exclusion and sanitation. And I've used an exclusion company myself. I don't want rats getting in my house. That's the only long-term effective way that's really going to, keep rodents out of structures. So just using hardware cloth, sealing off little tiny entrances and holes can do a lot. And there are more and more companies that are kind of starting to engage in that. I think it could be a really lucrative business model for more pest control companies. So I'm starting to see an increase in that, and exclusion is really the best solution.
Yeah, absolutely. It's at Project Coyote, the way we see it is that prevention is the best measure, preventing these problems from beginning, rather than waiting until we have rodent conflict and then trying to use these band-aid solutions like poisons that have all of these impacts throughout the ecosystems. So we always point people to there's sort of a host of resources under the term integrated pest management that you all can research that gets into basically leading with all of these preventative measures that you can use, simple things like closing up holes to the outdoors, around structures, making sure that, food access is sealed, all of those good things, that we use to promote wildlife coexistence with carnivore species as well, some of the exact same strategies. And just making sure that we lead with those preventative measures that are safer for everyone involved, getting to the root of the problem. And that's what we typically talk to policymakers and other stakeholders about too. Um, we have a few more minutes, so let me try and get to a few remaining questions, even though we unfortunately have so many, we're not going to be able to answer all of these. Um, we got a lot of questions actually about bait boxes. So these are those black plastic poison boxes that, it's proposed often that these are safer for wildlife because rather than just leaving the poisons out in the open, they're inside of these containers. I'm sure everyone in the audience has seen these around if you've never noticed them. They're these black plastic boxes outside of buildings. So we got a number of questions about those. Do you want to just speak to kind of your take on those, Lisa? If these are helpful, are they a solution?
I mean, it's probably better than just throwing out pellets of poison willy-nilly, but we know that other animals get into the bait boxes. Sometimes they actually get trapped in the bait boxes, like skunks often get their heads caught in the bait boxes. Animals of all kinds are attracted to these boxes. And we do know that insects and even songbirds, we have video of them going into the boxes, bringing the bait out. Sometimes rats will bring the bait out where other animals can get it. They're supposed to be indestructible. Of course, they're not. I mean, I actually think that's how bears are getting a lot of the poison. They can easily destroy these bait boxes. So they're just silly. They're terrible. They're everywhere. Sometimes they're not always black. They can be silver or gray. And sometimes they're actually disguised as like fake rocks. So it's insane. It's insane that we're doing this. And another thing that we've done is like community surveys of bait boxes just to find out how many are in a specific area and then kind of get the word out about that to try to use that as an educational tool. So that's something else people can consider. We did that in Seattle. And people are doing it in Berkeley actually, to this day. So the issue with the bait boxes, one issue I didn't mention is that sometimes they contain other types of poison, so it's not always anticoagulants. There are nerve toxins that are still legal. There's cholecalciferol, which is a vitamin D3 overdose. There's a lot of other poisons proliferating now. We don't recommend any of those. We just don't have the data yet on those that we do on anticoagulants. So, And oftentimes you'll see those types of poisons mixed with anticoagulants. So it's just this huge toxic cocktail. It's ridiculous. It's complete overkill. And yeah, it's wiping out all kinds of beneficial animals. So yeah, I guess they're better than throwing bait out loosely, but they're not better by much.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're at the end of our of our hour here, excuse me. I just dropped in the chat. We had some questions to about the website that Lisa mentioned with all of the solutions and alternatives to rodenticides. I just dropped the Raptors Are the Solution website there in the chat on their Got Rats page, so you can check that out. Um, please visit Project Coyote's website for any more downloadable resources. We have videos on rodenticides as well. So you can find many more resources on our website too at projectcoyote.org. And thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much, Laurel. Thank you so much, Lisa, for your time. I'm sure you have piqued many more people's interest in this issue, and I'm sure we're just going to keep the momentum going to try to make progress on rodenticide reform. So thank you so much for your work on this, both of you. And thank you all for joining us. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, Kiely, for organizing and inviting me to
Thank you, Laurel.
be involved.
Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing all this information with us.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end this recording now.
Thanks, Amelia.